My name is Carter, and I was married to Penelope for 7 years. Our life together seemed ordinary at first. Penelope was younger than me, and we got married not long after she finished college. She worked a steady office job, while my career involved frequent travel. I was often away for days or weeks at a time, moving between cities for business meetings. In the beginning, Penelope seemed unbothered by my absences. She encouraged me to focus on my work and supported the life we had built together. Over the years, however, her attitude shifted. She grew more vocal about her frustration with how often I was gone. Then, almost without warning, she stopped complaining entirely. It felt like she had resigned herself to the situation, and I assumed we had reached a quiet understanding. One Friday evening, we attended a housewarming party hosted by some close friends. We had waited until the last minute to choose a gift and decided to stop at a liquor store on the way to pick up a bottle of wine. Neither of us drank, but we knew our friends enjoyed wine and thought it would make a thoughtful gift. Inside the store, we received some assistance in selecting a good bottle, and everything about the purchase felt routine. But something unexpected happened that night that would shift the way I saw my wife and our marriage. While paying at the counter, I had a brief, seemingly inconsequential exchange with the cashier that left me unsettled. He mentioned something about our frequent visits to the store, which I found odd because I couldn't remember the last time we had bought wine. The comment lingered in my mind as we drove to the party, but I brushed it off as a mistake. Penelope gave no indication that anything was amiss. She looked as composed as ever, chatting about the evening ahead and the friends we were about to see. Yet, from that moment on, small doubts began to take root. They were vague at first, the kind of thoughts you push aside as unimportant. But over the following weeks, those doubts grew stronger, fed by subtle inconsistencies and strange moments that I couldn't ignore. Eventually, the truth would come to light in a way I never anticipated, unraveling everything I thought I knew about my wife and the life we shared. In the weeks following that evening at the liquor store, the cashier's words began to replay in my mind. I tried to dismiss them as a misunderstanding or a case of mistaken identity, but they planted a seed of unease. Penelope's calm demeanor that night hadn't done much to reassure me, either. As time passed, small things I might have overlooked before started to stand out. She seemed more preoccupied, often distracted by her phone, and sometimes she'd make vague excuses for leaving the house without explanation. I told myself not to overthink it. After all, she had her own life, her own friends, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was off. The turning point came a few weeks later when a scheduled work trip of mine was suddenly canceled. That morning, I had packed my bags, ready to leave on an evening train for a few days away. But shortly after lunch, I was told the trip was postponed because the client wasn't ready for the meeting. A part of me was relieved. I wasn't in the mood to travel and was looking forward to surprising Penelope with an unexpected evening together. I decided not to tell her the trip was canceled, thinking it might be nice to come home and ask her out for dinner. I imagined she'd be happy about the rare chance to spend an evening together. When I opened the door to our apartment, I called out her name, but what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Penelope was standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, carefully applying bright red lipstick. She wore an elegant dress that I hadn't seen her wear in years, not even for our anniversaries. She turned quickly when she saw me, her expression startled. "Home already?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I thought you'd be on the train by now." "The trip was cancelled," I said, watching her closely. "I thought I'd come home and invite you to dinner. But it looks like you were about to head out." She hesitated for just a moment, then smiled. "Oh, I was just planning to meet some friends. But since you're here, I'll cancel. Let me just grab my purse, and we can go." Her answer seemed smooth, almost too smooth. During the car ride to the restaurant, she exchanged a few text messages and declined a couple of calls. "The girls are upset I had to cancel on them," she said with a faint sigh, but her tone lacked sincerity. She stared out the window for the rest of the ride, avoiding conversation. At the restaurant, Penelope excused herself to the restroom. She left her purse behind, and I couldn't resist the temptation to look inside. Amid the usual clutter, I found a membership card for the very liquor store we had visited weeks ago. My heart sank. The cashier had been telling the truth. She had shopped there before, enough to have a rewards card. The implications were hard to ignore. Why would she hide this from me? And more importantly, who was she going there with? The memory of the man the cashier described, The tall, dark-haired, gray-bearded man surfaced in my mind. My thoughts spiraled as I tried to connect the dots. Penelope returned to the table shortly after, cheerful and seemingly unbothered, but the discovery in her purse had changed something for me. The next day, I couldn't focus on work. My mind was preoccupied with the lingering question of who the man might be. I began mentally going through people we both knew, but no one matched the description. That's when I remembered something Penelope had mentioned months ago. Her office had a new supervisor, a man she had casually referred to once or twice in conversation. I realized I didn't even know his name. Curious, I searched her company's website during lunch and found a section featuring the leadership team. There he was. Dark hair, gray beard, a perfect match to the description from the liquor store. My chest tightened as everything started to make sense. That evening, I told Penelope I was leaving for my rescheduled work trip after all. She seemed unbothered, even relieved, and I left the house with my luggage as if heading to the train station. Instead, I parked my car a few blocks away and waited. Less than an hour later, a sleek, expensive car pulled up to our driveway. Penelope stepped out of the house, dressed in a gown even more elegant than the one she had worn the previous night. She got into the passenger seat, and the car drove off. I followed at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. They stopped at the liquor store first, and her companion went inside alone while she stayed in the car. It was clear she didn't want to risk being seen again by the cashier. After a brief stop, they continued to an upscale neighborhood, pulling into the driveway of a private residence. Penelope entered the house willingly, laughing as she walked beside him. I didn't need to see anything else. I drove home, my mind numb and my chest heavy. There was no more denying what was right in front of me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every moment of the evening played over and over in my head. The laughter Penelope shared with her boss, the effortless way she stepped into his life when she thought I wasn't watching, it was all so clear now. The reality of her betrayal weighed heavily on me, but strangely, I didn't feel the anger I expected. Instead, there was a cold resolve forming. The years of trust we had built, the sacrifices I made for our life together, they meant nothing to her. Now, I had to decide what came next. The following morning, I put my plan into motion. While Penelope was still asleep, I packed a few of her things into suitcases, clothes, shoes, personal items. I placed them by the door and sent her a message while I sat in the living room, waiting. When she woke up and came downstairs, she found me sitting there with an expression I hoped was unreadable. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice nervous. "I think you know," I said quietly. She didn't argue. Instead, she stood there, her face pale and her lips pressed together. I told her what I'd seen, recounting everything in measured detail. Her trips to the liquor store, the late-night outings, and the final confirmation of her boss picking her up from our home. I laid it all out plainly, sparing neither her feelings nor mine. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, spin some elaborate story to excuse her behavior. But instead, she let out a long sigh and sat down on the couch across from me. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she said finally, as though there was a way to soften such a blow. "Don't," I interrupted. "Don't explain. Don't try to justify it. I don't want to hear why you did it. Just take your things and go." She nodded, almost resigned, and left to pack the rest of her belongings. I didn't speak to her as she moved in and out of the house, carrying her suitcases to the car. She didn't beg, didn't cry, and I think that hurt more than anything. There was no remorse, no apology, just quiet acceptance. It was like she had made peace with her decision long before I discovered the truth. Once she was gone, I didn't waste any time. I contacted a lawyer and began filing for divorce. My focus was sharp, my emotions buried under a sense of purpose. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. I knew this was the only way forward. In the days that followed, I cleared out everything that reminded me of her. Her photos, her favorite books, the little decoration she had chosen for our home, all of it was packed away and given to charity or discarded. It felt cathartic, like I was reclaiming my life piece by piece. One afternoon, I found myself back at the liquor store. The same cashier was there, and he recognized me immediately. "Sir, I didn't mean to cause trouble last time," he said nervously. "I'm really sorry." I shook my head. "Don't apologize. You told me the truth when no one else would. I owe you for that." He looked relieved, but I could tell he didn't know how to respond. Before leaving, I thanked him again, and this time, I meant it with everything I had. That young man, unknowingly, had been the catalyst for me to uncover what was really going on in my marriage. Life after Penelope wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. Once the initial shock of her betrayal wore off, I realized how much of myself I had lost in the marriage. The constant traveling, the effort to keep things afloat, the blind trust one had placed in her, all of it had drained me more than I cared to admit. Her infidelity felt like the end of one chapter but also the beginning of a better one where I could rebuild without lies weighing me down. The divorce was finalized quickly. Penelope didn't contest it. She seemed eager to move on, and I was happy to let her. The division of assets was clean, and I kept the house. It felt like a small victory to hold on to the space where we had lived, even if it no longer felt like ours. In the weeks that followed, I began to focus on myself for the first time in years. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages and started hobbies I'd always put off. I even changed jobs, opting for a role that didn't require constant travel. It was liberating to build a life that was no longer centered around someone who didn't value it. Strangely, I felt no lingering bitterness toward Penelope. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. What mattered was that I had the clarity to see the truth and the strength to act on it. I wasn't going to dwell on what was lost when I had so much ahead of me. One day, I returned to the liquor store, not for wine, but to thank the cashier one last time. He seemed surprised to see me but smiled when I explained how his honesty had changed my life. "It's not every day you meet someone brave enough to speak up," I told him. "You didn't have to say anything, but you did. I'll always be grateful for that." As I left the store, I felt a sense of closure. My past with Penelope no longer felt like a burden. It was simply part of the story that had led me to where I was now, stronger, wiser, and ready to move forward. Conclusion: life after Penelope wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. Once the initial shock of her betrayal wore off, I realized how much of myself I had lost in the marriage. The constant traveling, the effort to keep things afloat, the blind trust one had placed in her, all of it had drained me more than I cared to admit. Her infidelity felt like the end of one chapter but also the beginning of a better one where I could rebuild without lies weighing me down. The divorce was finalized quickly. Penelope didn't contest it. She seemed eager to move on, and I was happy to let her. The division of assets was clean, and I kept the house. It felt like a small victory to hold on to the space where we had lived, even if it no longer felt like ours. In the weeks that followed, I began to focus on myself for the first time in years. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages and started hobbies I'd always put off. I even changed jobs, opting for a role that didn't require constant travel. It was liberating to build a life that was no longer centered around someone who didn't value it. Strangely, I felt no lingering bitterness toward Penelope. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. What mattered was that I had the clarity to see the truth and the strength to act on it. I wasn't going to dwell on what was lost when I had so much ahead of me. One day, I returned to the liquor store, not for wine, but to thank the cashier one last time. He seemed surprised to see me but smiled when I explained how his honesty had changed my life. "It's not every day you meet someone brave enough to speak up," I told him. "You didn't have to say anything, but you did. I'll always be grateful for that." As I left the store, I felt a sense of closure. My past with Penelope no longer felt like a burden. It was simply part of the story that had led me to where I was now, stronger, wiser, and ready to move forward. If you enjoyed this story or found something meaningful in it, consider subscribing to my YouTube channel for more.